Does it bring you peace to know that Fred Durst did it all for the Nookie? The front runner, The Life of Steve Prefontaine, is available for pre-order. I've gotten some nice notes from people who beat that link like it owed them money. You can visit the bookseller of your choice, Powell's, bookshop.org, straight to the publisher, HarperCollins, Barnes & Noble. They're having a pretty cool sale for their members. It's like through this Friday, so you got to hustle. But if you're a member, you can't beat 25% off. Unless you ask for it for like your birthday or something. You get it for free, in which case you have free money and you can buy more of them. $32.99, $65.98, $98.97. I'm just spitballing here. Everything helps. Every author you know under the sun begs for pre-orders. It's just the game. It's the name of the game, man. And you only have so many dollars at your disposal, so I realize it's a big ask, but I'll just say consider it. And promotional support for the podcast. Let's do the NPR voice. Promotional support for the podcast is brought to you by the Power of Narrative Conference, celebrating its 26th year on the last weekend of March 28th and 29th. I can't do that. 300 to 400 journalists from around the world are coming. Keynote speakers, Susan Orlean, Connie Schultz, Dan Zak, Connie freaking Chung. Listeners of this podcast get 15% off enrollment if you use the code CNF15. It's coming up. To learn more, visit combeyond.bu.edu and use that CNF15 code. Much better.
It's more than just a book about someone. It's your book about someone.
Well, hey, CNFers, this is the Creative Nonfiction Podcast, a show where I speak to tellers of true tales about the true tales they tell. I'm your unreliable narrator and the voice of a generation, self-proclaimed Brendan O'Mara. Hey. Well, today we have John Eisenberg, who is the author of 11 books of nonfiction. That's right, a palindromic number. His latest being Rocket Men, the Black Quarterbacks Who Revolutionized Pro Football. I had this book in my queue for more than a year, forgot about it. John then followed up not too long ago, and I was like, okay, I'm going to make a point of reading this, get it in the pile. Then we were granted the second meeting of two black quarterbacks in the Super Bowl, Patrick Mahomes and Jalen Hurts. The first meeting ever being between these same two quarterbacks 2 Super Bowls ago. So it was time for an emergency podcast. If I had sound effects, I would just have sirens going off right now, but we're not that big of an operation. It really is a stunning book that details the institutional racism of the NFL, which could just be extrapolated to the institutional racism of this country, but we won't go there for this. The NFL posited that black men were intellectually inferior and unable to play quarterback at the level of white quarterbacks. Yeah, real classy. When black quarterbacks did get that rare opportunity to play under center, they were given such short leashes that if they didn't play perfectly, their careers were likely over. Like, they might even just have like 3 or 4 games, and if they just didn't play particularly well, they'd get benched, and then odds are they weren't getting re-signed. Again, they would often have to change positions. They would be like, you can play wide receiver or running back, but we just don't think you can handle the bandwidth that it takes to be a quarterback. Whereas a white quarterback might get several seasons and several opportunities to prove his worth. Have things changed? Well, at the quarterback position, you might say yes. Things have finally changed where nearly close to half of the league's starting quarterbacks are black men. But the same old issue is there for head coaches. Look no farther than Antonio Pierce and Gerard Mayo, who were fired after 1 season with the Raiders and the Patriots. This after given some of the shittiest rosters to deal with, only to be replaced by Pete Carroll, who's a soon-to-be 74-year-old white man, and Mike Vrabel, one of the most in-demand white coaches. I suspect they'll get several years to build the culture. But that's another book, and John is not willing to tackle that one. He had his plate full with this one, and someone else can write the head coach book. But we're not here to talk about that aforementioned, as of yet unwritten book. Show notes of this episode and more at BrendanO'Mara.com. Hey, there you'll find show notes to this episode and more. Anytime I've been getting the social media itch, the rash of it. Ew. I go to my website, noodle around with either like a blog post or a post to my anti-social media feed. Go check it out. I literally treat it like a fake social media feed with a timestamp and everything. I don't know if it's fun or sick. Also, sign up for the monthly Rage Against the Algorithm newsletter, where I spin some hot tracks. Not really, but it's a fun place to share some resources I think that will be of value to you. Certainly things that appeal to my taste over the month, and I then lay them out before you. And especially cool is the CNF and Happy Hour. No one does that. Go get it. First of the month, no spam. As far as I can tell, you can't beat it. Also, reviews and ratings never go out of style. I haven't asked for them in a while, and I feel like if I don't ask, then I never get them. So if you have a moment, maybe write a kind review for Apple Podcasts. I always read them on when I get new ones. Or leave a rating on Spotify. This way, the wayward CNFer might give this humble little show, which turns 12 in a few weeks, a chance. So John Eisenberg, he grew up in Dallas, Texas. Went to UPenn, so he's wicked smart, as my public school cronies from Apponequet High would say, and he became a newspaper reporter and a columnist at the, or for the, depends, I don't know, Baltimore Sun, among other gigs. He's covered the Super Bowl, Olympics, Cal Ripken's Ironman streak. Cal Ripken was my favorite player growing up, and why I wore the number 8, and why many people of my generation loved the number 8. Also loved Nomar Garcia Parra. I mean, could there have been a better name for a Boston Red Sox fan to have Nomar as your shortstop? I played shortstop, and I should have been a catcher, but that's neither here nor there. But I loved Nomar. Oh, he's a rookie in '96. He's just, oh man, he was such a badass. Where was I? John Eisenberg, the guest. He has a pretty cool Substack, The Bird Tapes, about historic Baltimore Orioles baseball interviews. And right now, you're going to hear from him, parting shot at the end, about where did all the fun websites go. And for now, let's settle in. This is a great conversation with me and John Eisenberg.
Well, I grew up sort of in a reading family. I mean, my first job was in a bookstore. My mother owned a bookstore in Dallas, Texas. My first job was sitting on the cash register. And so,
Nice.
I grew up with books in my hand, and it was sort of a reading environment. So I always loved that. And then I went to work as a journalist out of college, and I was writing for newspapers for years. But I never lost that sort of yearning. Let me give this a try. I would love to write a book someday. I set it as a goal. And so it was in the 90s. I was writing a column for the Baltimore Sun, and which was great. I was going around the world covering great events, and it was a glory days of newspapers, really. And it was a great job. And but I never lost that bug. So I was just looking for a story, and I was covering the Kentucky Derby one year. And a horse, a totally obscure horse by the name of Lil E.T. wins the Kentucky Derby in 1992. And the Sun said, all right, come back from Kentucky with that story, because it turned out he was foaled in New Freedom, Pennsylvania, which is just over the PA line from Maryland and 30 minutes from Baltimore, from my house. So it was like, they said, tell that story. So I start reporting out that story, and it's unbelievable. The story is unbelievable. The horse is foaled, modest pedigree. No one's ever heard of any of the bloodlines. And he gets sick. The horse is sick as a yearling, almost dies, and has this terrible intestinal problem. Then gets sold for $3,000, which is, that is chump change in the horse racing business. And this is years ago. There's that. And then he gets sold, and then he gets pinhooked, which if people don't know, is basically, it's like a used car dealer. They buy them, and they're going to turn them around and sell them. And so this is a horse that wins the Kentucky Derby. So I thought, well, this is so good. It's just a rags to riches story. And so I wrote the story for the Sun and introduced myself to all the principals, the owner, the trainer, the breeder, the jockey. It was Pat Day, famous Hall of Fame jockey. And so once I finished and turned that story in, I said, now that could be a book. That could be a book. And so, just dig way deeper into it. And I had no agent. I had no anything. I did have a profile. I mean, I was writing a column for a major newspaper, but so I found a publisher, University Press of Kentucky, right place. They liked it immediately and said, I didn't have to write. I mean, I wrote one chapter, as you do when you're selling a book. You don't have to write the whole book in nonfiction. So, and they said, we'll take it. And so it paid me a little bit of money, and off I went. And I did it strictly on the side from my job. I mean, I was covering the World Cup of Soccer. I'm covering, the World Series every year and the Super Bowl and all this stuff. And I'm sitting in press rooms writing this book. In the meantime, going around interviewing all the particulars and building this narrative. And so it was a mom and pop start. I mean, I didn't have an agent. I didn't have a big publisher. I didn't make much money, but I just wanted to write a book, and I really wanted to hold it in my hand. And so that eventually, it took a long time since I was doing it on the side, but eventually, yeah, I held that book in my hand, and it was very well received, which kind of, I was pleased about. And so that's what gave me the bug. And from that point forward, once you're a published author, you get, even with a small press, I mean, I got an agent after that. And then the agent started hooking me up with better publishers, and just slowly started climbing the ranks, of better publishers. And so, but it was that first one, that's the hard one to write, I think. And but it was a horse racing story that I fell in love with. And, to this day, I go back and look at that book and I thought, oh, that's not bad. The Lily T, the longest shot, I wrote it a long time ago, but it was definitely near my heart.
Oh, that's great. And what would you identify, some of the key lessons that you learned just from the experience of that first book that you've, since parlayed to double digits?
Yeah, 11 books. Well, certainly what I learned is, and especially what was important for me was I came into it, I am not a horse racing expert. I wrote columns on horse racing for the newspaper, and I'd go to the track, but I needed people to hold my hand and go around and carry, and learn. There's a whole language of the track, as you know. If you ask the question the wrong way, you immediately identified as, an amateur. Yeah. And so, there's also, so I really had to learn. The turf rider at the Baltimore Sun, Dale Austin, was great. An older guy with a big sense of humor, and he really held my hand. But once I get into the book, what I found, the lesson I learned was you really, work your sources. And if you find one, if you're lucky, you find one that is gold. And in my case, this trainer of Lily T, Lynn Whiting, was this old school trainer, son of a trainer, and had sort of really, he never ran a horse in the Derby unless he thought he could win. He had the right instincts. He wasn't after a big barn, big stable. He wanted to run a few horses, win some races, and a great horse landed in his barn, and he trained it up and entered it in the Derby and won. And it was the event of his lifetime. And he just held my hand through the whole thing. He just really taught me the ins and outs of horse racing, as well as, and what made this story different. So, I learned in there the value, it's so important to, you go into it with an idea of what the story is, in a large sense, the arc of the story, but it's in those details. How are you going to bring this thing to life? You may have the bone. It's the old thing. You may have the bones, but where's the flesh and blood? Who's going to give you the details? And Lynn Whiting just piled it on for me. He's no longer living. And he gave me so many great details and pointed me in the direction of the right people. And so, aside from learning about horse racing, I really learned about narrative nonfiction and that one, which was, you got to dig deep. And if you're lucky, you can report it all you want and on the clips and the archives and all that, but you really, if you find people that can really, really bring it to life and give you those details that make it leap off the page. You're lucky, and you've got a good book on your hands.
Mm. Yeah, there's interviewing for information, and then there's interviewing for scene. So how did you learn the skill of doing that to really, to get that meat on the skeleton, give it the muscle and the heart?
Yeah, that's a good question. Interviewing for information is what I pretty much did for newspapers all those years.
Yeah.
And interviewing for scene is what you have to do for books. I mean, you still need information, but you definitely need scene as well. So I don't know. It was strictly organic. I mean, that's a really interesting question. For me, it's just how you relate to people and becoming aware of what you need. Which, when you start out maybe writing nonfiction, you start out writing a book, nonfiction, and you've written for a newspaper, as I have. You've written columns, feature stories, and all that, and it's you have quotes supporting your text, and it's journalism. Let me tell you, it wasn't the first book that I realized this. It took me a little while, but what I realized is, you don't have to always put those quotes in there. It's maybe better off if you get this information, master it, and tell it yourself in your own voice. Develop a voice, and you drive the narrative, not someone else's voice. So, the most important part of that is interviewing people for scene, and knowing, getting those details. So I started learning it on that book. It took me a while to figure that out.
Right. Yeah. Especially coming from newspaper backgrounds where you do quote people extensively. You outsource a lot of that commentary to the people that you interview and talk to. And I fell prey to this. I mean, always, even with most recently with this Prefontaine biography I have coming out, like my early drafts were really, because so many of the people from the early 70s in that running culture were just such good talkers, especially Prefontaine, that sometimes you just want to leave their words there. But like over the course of a big narrative, and you know this as well as anyone, is you do have to be the authority, and you have to take control of the wheel and paraphrase things, put it into your voice. You still cite where you got that information from, but it's coming from your point of view and how you phrase what they say, and it puts your stamp on it.
Yeah, but it's your book. It becomes your book. It's more than just a book about someone. It's your book about someone.
Yeah.
And there is a difference. And I was fortunate. My second book, my first book for a major publisher, after I wrote that Lily T book, I got an agent. I wrote a book. I signed a deal and wrote a book for Simon & Schuster, which was great. Second book, Place to Land. And it was a book it was autobiographical. It was about growing up in Dallas in the 60s as a fan of the Cowboys. And just as a kid, it was really about my sort of memoir of being a kid in Dallas, where the Kennedy assassination was, when I was 7 years old. And it was really about the city growing up. It was about me growing up, and it was about the Cowboys growing up. Now they're sort of, the obnoxious America's team, but in the 60s, it was different. It was all pretty innocent. But, anyway, I wrote that book for Simon & Schuster. It was called Cotton Bowl Days. And my editor, Jeff Newman, who's really, really good editor, really smart, said something that to me, I had some great quotes, and I had them in there. And his comment to me, and I still tell people this, whenever I teach or talk to people, I said, his comment to me was, "You are not editing until you are leaving out things you like." All right. You haven't even started editing until you're leaving out things that you really like. And that just almost knocked me, to my knees. I was like, oh man, I like a lot of this, but, keep it a little bit shorter than you think. And, you're going to take that stuff out and maybe say it in your own words, shorter. And so that was a huge lesson for me.
Oh, that is tremendously good insight, and a good sense of when you're getting you're starting to get to the heart of things. You know you're starting to really reduce the sauce to something concentrated and good, to use a cooking metaphor, because yeah, there when you start seeing things that you're like that are on the floor now, you're like, man, that was good, and that took a lot of legwork to dig that up, and how I found that person, interviewed that person, spent 90 minutes on the phone with that person, and none of it actually is like in on the record, though it's never quite gone. It does
No.
inform the world you're building.
It causes you, though, to look at everything. And that is, if you think of your narrative, your through line of your book, what you're writing the book about is basically a straight line through the narrative. And so you can maybe sway from it a little bit as you go forward through there. You can go to the left, to the right, and get away from what you're writing about and tell some story that you've come across or somebody's backstory or whatever. You can get away a little bit, but not too often and not too far. Remember what you're writing about, and so that really sort of that's what lies underneath that lesson of you're not editing till you're taking stuff out that you like. It's like, remember what you're writing about, and even if you like it, does it really contribute to what you're writing about, to the thesis of this book, to the narrative? And if it doesn't, out. And
Mm-hmm.
even if it's great, and it's painful at times,
Yeah.
but you do it.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's very well put. And speaking of through line, at what point do you find the through line, be it through interviewing or archival research? When does it strike you and you're like, okay, here's the clothesline on which I can start hanging the narrative?
I think it comes at different times in different books.
Yeah.
Like that book about the Cowboys, for instance, the one that Cotton Bowl Days. It didn't. I wanted to write about my childhood growing up. I wasn't sure I was old enough to be writing about my childhood, but I wanted to do it. And the legendary people, sort of my experience as a fan, as a kid, and not until halfway through or even later did it just hit me like smack in the forehead. Look who's, as I described it just a few minutes ago, it was me growing up, it's the team growing up, and it's the city growing up. I didn't even think about that when I signed the deal to do that book. So that came to me as I was writing the book. And so this is as simple as that. You
Yeah.
can, and I was so excited when a couple of reviewers got it. It was just like, yeah, they totally understand. I didn't know that at first, but say, for instance, my most recent book, Rocket Men, about the history of black quarterbacks. I mean, I knew what the through line was before I started, and so, I'm going to tell a story here. It's going to be searing. It's going to be sad in a lot of ways. And, probably couldn't have even published this book 15 or 20 years ago because it was all just bad endings of people's careers for the most part. So I knew what I was getting into, and it was going to be tough. And fortunately, the last 5 to 10 years in pro football, there's been an opening of the door of opportunity, and it gives it a better ending. And so I pretty much knew from the start. So it depends. It really can be different.
Yeah, I love that sense of discovery of, you went into that Cotton Bowl days, and it's just like, yeah, as you did your research and plumbed your memory and started to, figure it out, it ends up kind of like the Polaroid picture starts to come into focus more. And but you didn't, like you said, you didn't know that heading in. And I think sometimes we can get into trouble by painting ourselves in a certain corner, but we really do need to leave our minds open to discovery, and that only comes through doing the work and letting it kind of letting the current of that reporting kind of dictate where the story goes. Don't try to force it. Like, kind of surrender to what you find.
Oh, definitely. You don't know what you're going to find, and you don't know sit down in any interview. You don't know what's going to come out of it, and a lot of times it will be something that can drive a narrative, or a particular character's place in a narrative. You weren't expecting that at all, and you're going to. This definitely happened in Rocket Man for me, because I was writing about really well-known people, Patrick Mahomes and Lamar Jackson, all these guys, and I didn't get to them. I mean, interviewing the top echelon media superstar people now. You don't just sit down for the old one-on-one like you. I mean, it's really, really hard. Then most of them have their own YouTube channels, or they just don't want to do that stuff anymore. So it's really hard. So I had to talk to people around them and really, really searched for the right people that could give me some insight into them. And that was how I had to go about that book. And even though I knew what the larger structure, the narrative was about, I needed those details, and I didn't know what I was going to get. So I definitely searched around and interviewed different people, found the right people to give me some insights that people didn't know. So I didn't know. And I felt like, well, I'm pretty attuned to this stuff. So I guess most people don't know about these guys.
So when you set out to write Rocket Men, what was or who was your first phone call as you're starting the process of building the mass that would become the book?
Well, my first set of phone calls, this is fourth or fifth book of football history I've written. My book, The League, has really is the one for me that's really broken through and done well for a number of years. And I've written early Green Bay Packers, early Vince Lombardi history, wrote another book on the Cowboys and the Dallas Texans in the early 60s, AFL, NFL. So that whole era, I sort of developed a clan of people, that I could go to, historians or scouts or people that just knew about it. So I called a bunch of them, and said, "Yeah, can you walk me through that era in regards to this story?" And I have to tell you, there were quite a few that said, "You know what? I think I'm going to sit this one out." I don't, I like working with you. I like your books, but this is a little bit of a hot potato, and it doesn't necessarily reflect well on the NFL. And a lot of people don't mind digging into that, but some people do. Yeah. And so, that was my introduction to the fact that, well, this is going to be a little different. This story is definitely, people react to it differently than the other just basic football history that I've written, because it's a book about race. Right off the bat, I knew, okay, you're in a different lane here.
What would you identify as an early victory for your research and your reporting as you were, starting to get more information?
Well, it was certain guys. There were, I wrote this book during the pandemic, and so travel was limited, and it was harder to get a hold of some people. And, I was really, some of it had to be on the phone, which I don't like doing, but you just had to do it. And it was a little worrisome, to be honest with you, that I could get everything that I needed. And I had an interview with James Harris, who is in the book, was a quarterback in the 70s, the Los Angeles Rams. And he's one of the first black quarterbacks in the NFL, the modern NFL. I knew him a little bit because I'm in Baltimore. I've spent a lot of time around the Baltimore Ravens. I actually worked for the Ravens at one point, writing for their digital side. And I knew James a little bit. And he's got a very interesting, because he had tremendous problems in the late 60s and early 70s getting a chance to play. His experience pretty much sums up what was going on for many years. So I got him on the phone. He doesn't do a lot of interviews. And we started talking. And he was just unbelievable. He's such a storyteller. He's from the South, and he's out of that old Southern storytelling, niche of this world, which I love. And he just started rolling. And, I asked him one question at one point. What was it like to get, you're from a little town, Louisiana, you're coming out of Grambling, you get never even been around white people, and, grown up in the Jim Crow South practically. And then you get drafted by the Buffalo Bills and you go up to Buffalo to try to make the team. What was that summer like? And he talked for half an hour about just unbelievable experience. Yeah. When he went up there. He didn't have a contract. he needed money to buy sandwiches at night, and the team gave him walking around money, but they made him work for it. They made him clean his teammates' cleats
Yeah.
and stuff that you just cannot believe. And so he told me this story, literally half an hour, and I was like, and then he gets to the end of it, and I'm like stunned. I'm silent. I was like, you know what, James, that's an unbelievable story, and really we should just stop right there. Really, that should be a book in itself. The summer of '69. I mean, there was so much that went on, and so that interview, and I said, you're onto something here. You got to find more people like this. Easier said than done, but it's poignant and important and searing, as I said, stuff for them. And so get them talking on it. You're good.
Mm. So what was the very early experience for black quarterbacks in professional football?
Well, James is, we're talking modern football. I mean, really, there were no black players in the NFL the 12 years, through World War II. There were a few in the first decade and then none from 1934 to 46 or 33 to 45. I think it was 12 years. Terrible. The worst, thing. You look at the history of the NFL, it's segregated, just like Major League Baseball. And they did reintegrate after the war. And there was a trickle of players, black players into the 50s. They started drafting players sort of grudgingly, but certainly we're not going to give quarterbacks an opportunity because the game was evolving. Football was becoming much more sophisticated. The offenses were complex. And very honestly, there was just a racist ideology. I mean, the people in charge didn't believe that a black player, were they smart enough to handle these offenses? Would white teammates lead? Would they work hard? Just everything you could imagine, there was doubt. And so the black experience for quarterbacks coming out of college for many years was you're going to play wide receiver. You're going to be a running back. We like you as an athlete. We're not sure whether you're smart enough. I mean, it's just basic. There it is. And so they had to change positions. So it was just galling, and I put some stories in there, even a first round draft pick, Eldridge Dickey of the Oakland Raiders in 1968 had to change positions. Super, super talented kid that, given the power, support of an organization, say today, definitely given time to develop, could have been an NFL quarterback, but that opportunity didn't happen. So, and it's really, this whole thing is a story of opportunity. So the experience was they couldn't even get on the field. And then finally, a couple did, James Harris being one, finally gets a little bit of a chance. A coach gives him a chance. Doug Williams is a seminal figure in the story. He's drafted in the first round, eventually wins the Super Bowl. And you get into that first generation of guys that got to play, Doug Williams and then Randall Cunningham, Warren Moon. And so those are the guys that at least went out and showed the football world that a black person could play quarterback, because until they came along, it just didn't happen.
Yeah, and I think all the more tragic as well is like, okay, when some of these athletes got an opportunity to be under center, the leash that they were playing with was so short. I mean, even if they had a few bad games, it might be the end of their career if they just had like a 3-game funk, whereas white quarterbacks were granted 2, 3, or 4 seasons to learn on the job. And that to me was particularly striking.
Very true. Unbelievably true. I did a whole chapter on Joe Gilliam, who played for the Pittsburgh Steelers in the 70s. Just an amazing talent, drafted from an HBCU and shows up. And he's so good that the Steelers don't get rid of him, even though Terry Bradshaw's on the team. But yeah, there's a player strike, a union strike in 1974, and Bradshaw's out of camp, and Joe Gilliam gets the job, and he's just electric. And the strike ends, and Bradshaw comes back. He's sitting on the bench. Joe Gilliam's playing and winning. He's running around. He's decades ahead of the what the football teams wanted from their quarterbacks in the 70s was wide, straight drop back, don't run around, throw a big pass maybe, but don't run around. Joe Gilliam was running around and doing his own thing and talking trash. And 6 games he started, and his performances were up and down a little bit, but he won 4. They were in first place. He loses his job, and he never has another chance. He's 24 maybe when this happens to him. Never has another chance in the NFL. A guy that was, on the cover of Sports Illustrated when that was a big deal, and showed that he could, but there's too many forces working against him, and this is in the 1970s. So it's a long time ago, but it's not ancient history.
No. No, you really get a sense of the institutionalized racism, whereas like where the black quarterbacks were either their position would get changed if they wanted the opportunity to play, and then what you start to see is because of that there's no examples for players coming up. They just realize, well, if I'm a very good quarterback coming out of college, they're going to force me to change positions. So maybe some do. And then as a result, more of these great black quarterbacks they're just starting to sort of self-select themselves to go in different directions. And as a result, you start seeing the proliferation of white quarterbacks. And now everyone sees it like only white quarterbacks exist. And it's a generational process. And it takes generations to undo it. And only now are we starting to see the pendulum swing to a greater sense of equity and opportunity on the field.
Yeah, only now is really true. I mean, and it is really in the last 5 years. Part of the reason I wrote the book is, as I said, I was in Baltimore, actually working for the Ravens, and Lamar Jackson lands, right in front of me, and he's a unbelievable player, Heisman Trophy winner. And his experience in the draft was the San Diego Chargers said, "Are you going to run the 40? Because we think you'll be a good receiver." And, Bill Polian, who's in the Hall of Fame, a general manager, says, "I don't know that Lamar should play another position." This is in 2018. The NFL is 98 years old. This is still happening. The same thing that happened to players like in the 30s. So I said, this is, a part of the reason I wrote it was seeing that. And also, as you said, I mean, I was in press boxes in the 80s, the 90s, covering the Super Bowl, covering all this stuff. And very honestly, I missed this story. And I felt badly about it. I mean, I was well aware there were not many black quarterbacks. I wasn't aware. I covered the Super Bowl where Doug Williams won the was MVP, first black quarterback in a seminal moment in football history, and the opening of the door. People thought, oh, it's like Jackie Robinson and all this stuff. It wasn't. But, we thought it'd be that. I didn't realize till I started to dig into it, the next 25 Super Bowls were won by white quarterbacks. Everybody said, oh, well, Doug has won. It's all going to change. Well, it didn't. It didn't change at all. There were a little bit more opportunity for a few guys, but not a lot. And the same sort of doubts and sort of institutional racism, maybe it's not what it was, but it's certainly not gone away. It was still there. And I thought, boy, this is a story, and I missed it. And I feel like, the least I can do, I've written 10 books. The least I can do is do what I do, bring to bear, go in and dig into this story and do the research and interview people and shine a light on it, because it's there. And it's a story that needs to be told.
Well, yeah, as you read the entire story, and then you meet Lamar Jackson in your book, and you hear a Bill Polian echo the things that were said of these athletes from the 30s, 40s, 50s, like through all time. It does hit you in the gut in a different way, where it's like, oh wow, like, man, the systems in place, they move at a glacial pace, and it's still very much happening today. I mean, Jamel Hill had a wonderful riff on on our podcast that was on Instagram about like the MVP race between Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson. Side by side, Lamar should and better win it this year. And it's like, she's like, it was his reluctance to code switch. And it's like where a lot of people, he doesn't look or sound like the prototypical quarterback. And you're like, oh my God, it still exists.
It's really, really true what Jamel says. And, I address this in the book.
Yeah.
And, and I felt like, and, here I am, a white author writing about this. And I wanted to find, people to confirm this for me. I can't just say it. And I felt this was a case where I needed other people to say it. And I found some historians and, a professor of African American history at, Ole Miss and different people to talk about that, and Lamar in particular, about how, he symbolizes something, to Black America. He's different. He definitely, he is not code switching, and he's the Ravens haven't made him do it, and he is who he is. He's very much his own person, and it's great. And so, I had a lot of people sort of talking about that, and it's very interesting to watch it unfold. And yes, he's had to deal with it. He's a positive young man and a really good natured. And so he can definitely deal with it. But it is interesting to watch it. I think it was just a year or two ago. Who was it? Some commentator somewhere that said, "Oh, Lamar is not that quarterbacky." Made up a word. And and every my alarm just went up. It's like, oh no, look at this. It's still happening.
Yeah, and while the opportunities for Black quarterbacks to be drafted very high and to have a chance to succeed and have a chance to have a longer window through which to prove their skill, prove their worth. What we're starting to see now is that, and just through reading your book, I kind of noticed this, like the Black head coach is kind of like what the Black quarterback was decades ago. Like look at Antonio Pierce and Gerard Mayo recently. They got 1 year with shitty teams and they got fired with no players and no support. And then they're bringing in the 74-year-old white guy, and then the other white guy to come in and save the day. It's like they didn't get the same chance to build the culture. They were in and gone, just like the old Black quarterbacks.
So true. And I can't tell you, as I went around promoting this book, how many people said, "Oh, what is volume 2 on the coaches?" And I'm like, that's a valid question, and it's certainly what volume 2 should be about. I think I'm going to let someone else write it, but it is a very valid story. And those examples you cite, just to tell you everything you need to know. There's plenty of great Black coaches in the league, and they tons of them, and they certainly deserve that opportunity, the head coaching opportunity. But it's very much an old boys club. You're as it was with the era of Randall Cunningham and Warren Moon and those first guys that get a chance. Few make it through. Somehow squeeze through the gates that have been closed. Somehow they squeeze through, and they're in the arena, and that's great. And they will change things for everybody. But it has to happen now for coaches. There's no doubt about it, and that's going to be hard. That's going to be hard because these owners, very clearly, the one and done mentality, pretty much. And there's other ones, the Houston Texans, how many years in a row did they fire a Black coach? There were 2 or 3 in a row, for 1 year. And I was like, wow, I mean, that's just incredible. So, it's very tough sledding for them.
As you get later in the book and you're starting to see the quarterbacks of really thrive, you have Mahomes, Jackson, Kyler Murray, among others. Now is Jaden Daniels there, who's done exceptionally well, who isn't in your book because he was still in college at the time, but we're seeing him take a team to the NFC Championship game. What really struck me late in the book was how just how much it's meant to the Doug Williams and the Warren Moons of the world, like to see what has come, what they endured, and to see the success of these young quarterbacks, to see how it affects them. I imagine that was pretty moving for you too, just to see how important it was to them, seeing the success of the quarterbacks now.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring that up. Really true. And Warren Moon in particular was very much, he was a friend of the book. All right. Warren Moon was very helpful. Mm-hmm. He got into it, and, he's on the cover of the book, as he should be, but along with Patrick Mahomes. But, I used him a lot, and he told me, he said, listen, when I was playing, when I was a younger man, I didn't want to be known. You sort of understand it. He said, I didn't want to be known as a black quarterback. I wanted to be a good quarterback, I didn't want to be defined that way. But he said, all these years later, I see the big picture, and what I did, and, opening the door, however much, along with Doug and a few other guys, and what it has meant. And, it's incredibly important to him. It's, he takes great pride in that as well he should. So that was very, very gratifying. He really just put it straight in words. I rejected it, I believe, in his Hall of Fame speech. But he understands now, because the door has opened. Finally, I do believe, and I was as cynical as anybody on this subject, but I do see these teams now not seeing color at that position anymore. It just really seems like the opportunity is there if you're good. And that's all anybody ever wanted. So, the opportunity. So it really has changed. But really, in the last 5 years, are you seeing these really, really talented black quarterbacks coming out of college and going high in the draft and letting franchises, give them the keys to the offense? You're only just starting to see it, but it's happening. And I don't think there's any going back. I think it's here to stay.
Right. And I think you make the point in the book also that for the first time in the last few years, maybe 10 years or so, like it might extend a little farther back, but how the college game is influencing the NFL game instead of the other way around. And that was a much more freewheeling, expansive offenses that played well to these young quarterbacks coming up. And so that's really, the coaches are coming out of that system, and then the players are coming in from those coaches. So now we're seeing a much more explosive, dynamic NFL product as a result.
Football has changed. I mean, we talked earlier about how you don't know about some things what surprises do you have when you're reporting out a book? I had a few moments in this book, and it was all towards the end. It was like, what's really happened here is the nature of quarterbacking in pro football has changed. I mean, really changed. And, I'm a fan like anyone else. And I guess I just hadn't thought of it quite so simply like that. It's like, the quarterback position is really different than it was even just 15 years ago. And so that is a huge development that has, and then, teams have opened their eyes to it until then. And you're talking about like 2010, any quarterback that came into the league, the NFL team looked at him and said, we're going to teach you to do what we do. So then it finally flipped, where it was like, we're going to let you do what you do, and we're going to, let what you do determine what we do. Yeah. And that was just a seminal change. As I reported it out, it just hit me very clearly when it happened. Was the generation in the early 2010s, Russell Wilson and Colin Kaepernick, Cam Newton, and I'm trying to think. There's Robert Griffin. He got hurt, mm-hmm. But those were high draft picks that came into the league. The league didn't say you have to play the way we do. We're going to let you be you. Those guys immediately started winning. They most of them made a Super Bowl. Russell Wilson won a Super Bowl. Probably should have won 2 Super Bowls. And he. So those were great quarterbacks, and that's the moment it flipped. I think is really the moment where teams said, "Hey, we can pro football looked at that generation and said, we can put our teams in the hands of these guys, this type quarterback who are black, and we can be fine. And, that was really the biggest change, I think, in letting, and what has gone on now here in the last 4 or 5 years. Finally, they saw it's going to be okay if we do that.
Mm. And when you were, synthesizing and generating your pages for the book, I always love digging into how you organize your work, all your, interview transcripts and, whatever documents you might have. So how did you approach the writing of this and the process through which you wrote this particular book?
This was a hard one because from a narrative standpoint, because almost all of my books have been, I wrote about the start of pro football in Dallas when there were two teams, a 10-gallon war, and the Dallas Texans left and went to Kansas City and became the Chiefs. That's a 3-year window. Okay, 3-year window. I wrote about Vince Lombardi's first year in Green Bay, 1959, when he set in motion everything that ultimately led to the titles. 1-year window there. I wrote a book, in 2006, I wrote a book called The Great Match Race about the first major, it's a book of history, the first major sports event in American history, a North-South horse race in 1823. That a very narrow time frame. So, I didn't have a long span to cover this story of the quarterbacks. It's 100 years, just huge, just one framework, one setting after another, one generation after another. How am I going to tie this together? How can I make it not just be like a series of magazine articles? Yeah. First I'm going to do what happened with Fritz Pollard, who's a famous one in, the early 1920s. And then story about him, and then go to somebody in the 50s, and then go to Marlon Briscoe, who played for the Denver Broncos in 68, and then Doug Williams. How can I make them all part of a narrative? That was a big challenge. And so that really involved more writing. I thought you really have to figure out where all of these people fit into the timeline that I'm spooling here. How do they fit into it, and tell people that? Not, remember that this is a timeline. This is not just their story. This is a story that is part of a bigger story. I sort of just identified when I went into it, who are the guys I'm going to write about? And there's, not that many because there weren't, but I wanted to identify the guys that had failed too, that not failed, but they didn't get the chance. Because those stories are really important. So I just selected a bunch of, 10 to 12 guys that I wanted to highlight. So, and I decided, and also what was tricky about this one, it's a book unspools chronologically. Yeah. I start in 1920 and I end in, 2020. So I almost never do that with any book, a nonfiction book. I've always found, well, you start at a certain point that's dramatic, and then maybe that brings in the reader, and then you go back and explain why I started there and what the drama is, and then you go through the backstory and keep moving the narrative forward, maybe at a couple of different time frames as you move through that eventually come together. This was completely different. This was start at the beginning and end at the end. And so in one sense, it was a little easier, it's just going one direction here. And so that was good, but it was very tricky. What was tricky was finding out, making sure that there was a narrative there, that it went smoothly. And like I said, where they fit into this. And so, that was hard. And the hardest part, as I mentioned earlier, was finding the people to talk about it. Mm-hmm. I was turned down by a number of people. That hadn't happened to me before in a book. People really didn't want to talk. Some people, I guess it was too hot button of an issue. Mm-hmm. So I had to find certain sources. So that is a big stress when I wrote this. And so, there's some serendipity involved. Greg Roman currently the offensive coordinator of the Chargers. Okay, he was the offensive coordinator of the Ravens when I was there, and he sort of unleashed Lamar Jackson. Okay, turns out he was also the offensive coordinator of the 49ers when they had Colin Kaepernick. So Greg Roman was tremendous for me. I could sit down with him. I got him. And I said, let's talk about Kaepernick. And then let's talk about Lamar, and let's talk about black quarterbacks. So I had to really work this sort of network and figure out who are the right people to talk to. And so guys like that just saved me, and really gave great insight, and the flesh and blood as well as the bones that we talked about. So those were the real challenges right there.
Yeah, Greg Roman's the unofficial Harbaugh brother right there.
Yeah. Yes. Well, the Ravens fans got tired of him, and I like him personally, and he's a good football coach, and I always appreciate anybody that likes a written word. We sat down to talk, and he told me his uncle was a sports writer, and he likes the written word, and so we were in good shape there. And he gave me a great interview. So I came across a few guys like that. T. Martin, who had won a national championship for Tennessee as a quarterback, a black quarterback. He flamed out. Then he got in in the pros, got into coaching. And it turns out, he mentored Cam Newton. I needed somebody to talk about Cam Newton. Well, T. Martin was his personal quarterback coach in high school when T was trying to figure that stuff. I had no idea.
Yeah.
Completely stumbled onto that. And so he had this unbelievable insight into Cam Newton's background and what made him tick. So, I very honestly got a little lucky there. And stuff like that, when I kept finding people to talk about these guys, and that was great.
That's I love hearing you talk about the serendipity of just finding a connection or a source who knows someone. You didn't know that this particular person overlapped with so-and-so. Or you go into an archive looking for one letter, you stumble across something else that totally speaks to something that is in the book. You're like, oh my God, I would have never found this in a million years. It's part of the stress, but also the joy of doing this. You're like, oh my God, what else am I missing out there? Or who else could I talk to that I just haven't, who might be able to shed some light? That's kind of the panic, but also kind of the fun.
Yeah, I'll give you one. I was just really struggling. Who am I going to get to talk about Russell Wilson's early days in the NFL with the Seahawks? Such an interesting period of time and such a dramatic story. But who can I get? I don't know Russell. He doesn't really do interviews like that. And then it hit me. I had interviewed Warren Moon, and Warren was great, talking his own story. And then he's on the radio broadcasts. He's in Seattle, and he knows Russell well. He's helped him out when he got to town, and had a huge connection to him. I mean, he's flying on the plane with him after games.
Yeah.
He was in the front row. He was in the front row of Russell Wilson's beginnings in the NFL. And I don't remember when it hit me. Maybe I was going for a run or something, but I said, you're an idiot. It's right in front of you. Look at this. Warren Moon is the person to talk to. Just call him. And so, yeah. And he was great. And he just was so informative about Russell and really brought texture to it. And so that really helped me tell that story of, Russell coming to the Seahawks. So, but that's there's sort of the same thing with Greg Roman. So you find just the right piece that fits from a storytelling perspective. And that's when you are on your way to building a good book.
Well, John, as we bring these conversations down for a landing, what I always love asking the guests for just a fun recommendation for the listeners. And that can just be anything that you find that's just making you happy. They're like you want to share with someone. That can be anything from a brand of socks to a book you're reading. It's whatever is lighting you up. What would you recommend?
Oh man, well, I'm an old English major. I read a lot. I read a lot of fiction, and I read a book. It's not a brand new book, but the book Trust by Hernan Diaz. is a fiction book that just really is the one that I've read fairly recently that I cannot get out. It was such a beautifully crafted book, one of the most beautifully crafted and written books I've ever read.
Mm.
And I can't recommend that book highly enough. Trust. And so that one, I feel good about throwing that out there. I really, really enjoyed it.
Oh, that's amazing. Well, John, Rocket Man was such a great sort of cultural biography of the position of black quarterbacks. It's just it's such a great read, a great history, an important history, I think. And so just thank you so much for the work that you've done, especially that this most recent book, and that carving out some time to talk shop. Thanks a lot.
Well, I really appreciate you having me on. Really enjoyed it. Thank you.
This emergency pod came during a week where I had to read my book for the final time, thank goodness, and another book for another pod, and so I had to read 3 books this week. 3 books. The front runner for the dozenth time or so or more, who the hell knows. John's, and then this other one. It was a bear to keep my eyes from shriveling up to raisins. Raisins, as the saying go, are the windows to the soul. Thanks to John for the time, for coming on for this emergency podcast. A great time to celebrate the painfully slow progress of black quarterback acceptance in professional football. Now, if only the coaching ranks would catch up, but hey, give it 50 more years. Give it 50 more years. Maybe we'll get there. And by then, it might just be flag football. Thanks also to the Power of Narrative Conference for promotional support. Pre-orders for the Frontrunner are open, and consider visiting patreon.com/CNFpod to support the pod and get some one-on-one time with me to talk shit out. Sometimes you need to talk shit out. Of late, I've been having fun writing blog posts. I know, so retro. They are usually short essays on long running, usually about 200 to 300 words, on a riff that comes to my mind when I'm out for a jog or a walk. It's very old school, man. The idea of a pre-social media internet where you had to seek out people you liked, bookmark their websites and actively visit them to see if they posted anything new. I miss the internet when there were fun things to read to waste your time on. It was like browsing in a magazine stand or something. You had the agency of consumption of what you wanted to see on your terms, really. That's why I still love Maria Popova's The Marginalian, formerly Brain Pickings. I'm not always crazy about her writing style. I can take it or leave that at times, but I love that it's always about art, philosophy, creativity, well curated stuff, nourishing place to hang out for a while. Like a path through a garden. There's no video, no ads, no audio, just text. I hate when you click on a link that you think might be an article. You're like, oh, that seems like cool thing to read. And it's like, psych! It's actually a 90-minute podcast. I'm like, fuck. Not everything has to be a podcast. This is from the guy who's recording a podcast. I used to love, but not anymore, like Tim Ferriss's blog, because there was always some life hacky thing. When I was into life hacky things, I am no longer into life hacky things. I mourn the time that I wasted in my late 20s and early 30s in that sort of biohacking, life optimization spat that happened around that time. But we're not going to go there. Maybe someday, but not now. I like that Austin Kleon still blogs almost every day, like it's 2009. And Seth Godin, of course, has been blogging every day since like 1934 or something, or, a little more contemporaneous than that. I guess I just miss when people blogged about shit they were into. Not to build a brand, not to be an influencer of any kind. Just, this is our little platform. This is the garden we get to tend, and these are the plants I choose to seed, if you will. So yes, I've been writing more blog posts. I post these parting shots as part of the show notes of a particular episode, and they act kind of as blog posts. My newsletter riff is like a super blog post. Anyway, thing is, we got lazy. And that's going to be another blog post. We outsourced the network effect and the community building to these mega tech platforms. It corralled us for their own needs. They locked us in. That was the strategy. It worked. It still works. So posting to Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Blue Sky, Snapchat, Threads, it all feels effective in a way. And maybe someone wins the virality lottery one day, and what does that really net you? I can't imagine it's much, except maybe that shiny new stalker you never asked for. Point being, there's joy in inconvenience. I don't care if 0 people read my stupid little blog post about some inane thought I had while laboring through 4 or 6 mile run. I may or may not share it on social media to build a wee bit of awareness, but honestly, more people listen to this parting shot than will ever see a Blue Sky post or an Instagram story. And trust me, not many people listen to this point, depressingly little. Maybe find the love of blogging again. Find the love of blogs again. Try not to outsource it to Substack, who really harness the means of distribution. Like, that's an easy part. That's seductive. I don't trust Substack. Be okay with making people find you. It's frustrating and slow. And there was never much of a rush until we were brain fucked by social media. So maybe slow down a moment and remember it wasn't always this way. And we don't have to keep putting coins in the slot machine. Know what I'm saying? So stay wild, CNFers. And if you can't do, interview. See ya.